So before we begin, I would request respected participant to kindly mute yourself so that we can avoid disruptions. Thank you so much. Let us begin today's Swadhyaya Chakra talk with an invocation of a prayer. So let me just share the screen.
सर्वेत्र सुखिनः सन्तु सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु मा कश्चित् दुःखमाप्नुयात्।
शान्तिः अन्तरिक्षं शान्तिः पृथिवी शान्तिः आपः शान्तिः औषधयः शान्तिः वनस्पतयः शान्तिः विश्वे देवाः शान्तिः ब्रह्म शान्तिः सर्वं शान्तिः शान्तिः एव शान्तिः साम शान्तिः एति। शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः।
Thank you so much for your kind attention. Namaste, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in this beautiful evening. Greetings. I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, from School of Humanities and Social Sciences of Raffles University, on behalf of my university, I welcome you. I also welcome you on behalf of Swadhyaya Chakra family, Biswanidhan Center for Asian Blossoming. Welcome to the talk on the very topic, post-secular dialogues, Fred Dallmayr. As you know, Fred Dallmayr, tomorrow is his 93rd birthday, and he is a very deep thinker, deep seeker of our times. He turns 93 on October 18, 2021. In this symposium, we walk and meditate with this exemplary scholar in our time. It is a great pleasure and indeed an honor to have available with us distinguished speaker, Professor Kumar Giri from Madras Institute of Development Studies, Chennai, Professor John Clammer, Jindal Global University, Sonepat, Haryana, Dr. Edwin from Don Bosco College, Dharmapuri, Tamil Nadu. Welcome you, sir. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our Chief Patron, Honorable Dr. Justice Meena Vigombar, former Chief Justice of Rajasthan High Court, Professor Divakar Kumar Goli, President of Raffles University, and all the participants, Swadhyaya Chakra family, viewers, both on Facebook and Zoom platform, and listeners. Before the talk, let me give a brief introduction to our Swadhyaya Chakra dialogue. Swadhyaya Chakra, co-learning circle of self and mutual studies. It is an initiative of studying and learning together self, culture, societies, and the world. Friends associated with this are eager to walk and mediate with new horizons of thinking, new movements of social and cultural change at our work in our contemporary world. We study seekers such as Sri Aurobindo, Mahatma Gandhi, a Chitranjan Das, a creative soul, creative thinker from Odisha, and many others from around the world. We also present our own writings and reflect our own creativity together. We also invite seekers from different fields of life to share us with their lives, visions, sadhana, and struggles for creating a world of beauty, dignity, and dialogues. We meet every Sunday or sometimes on Wednesday. Now we are nurturing this dialogue in collaboration with School of Humanities and Social Science of Raffles University and Rage Global Foundation, USA. This is manifested in the title of today's talk itself, that the very concern of today's symposium, renowned philosopher, political thinker, Fred Dallmayr, and his visionary writings provide us to envision future celebration of ideas of truth, beauty, and diversity is hallmark of his thinking. Professor Dallmayr advocates a politics of common good, collective welfare, which requires the cultivation of public ethics, open dialogue, public conscience, and civic responsibility. Professor Dallmayr restores the notion of the good life as a hallmark of personal conduct, civic virtue, and political engagement, and as a roadmap to ensure just social order. With this brief introduction, now I would like to invite Professor Kumar Giri sir to kindly moderate the session. Sir, over to you.
Thank you so much, Randhir, and a warm welcome to Father Edwin George, Professor John Clammer, and all friends co-present with us, with Professor Fred Dallmayr, just a day before his 93rd birthday. And we take this opportunity to walk and meditate with the vision and thought of Professor Fred Dallmayr, who has lived an exemplary life of seeking, learning, and mutual sharing. So in this symposium, we wish to discuss about his work with this title, Post-Secular Dialogues, Fred Dallmayr at 93. Professor Dallmayr's work has spanned many issues of philosophy, of history, of religion, spirituality, and many concerns. So in this symposium, in this dialogue, we want to focus a bit on the whole question of the post-secular, but of course we would be enriched by many other concerns that Father Edwin George and Professor John Clammer would give to us. Father Dr. Edwin George has written a doctoral work on Professor Fred Dallmayr, and he has lived with him for almost 2 weeks in Notre Dame. So it is enriching to have the presence and thoughts of Father Edwin George. And Professor John Clammer also has met with Professor Fred Dallmayr. He has engaged with some of the works of Professor Dallmayr, such as his very important book, Dialogues Among Civilizations. So in my offering to our conjoined thinking this afternoon, I wish to present this with these themes: post-secular dialogues, Fred Dallmayr and the calling of upholding our world, regenerating our earth, and planetary Lokasangraha. The next slide, please. Fred Dallmayr has been an inspiring seeker of friendship, beauty, dignity, dialogue, and transformation in our world. Has been an inspiration for sense of humility, courage, and karuna, and he has always helped us to understand the challenge of the contemporary apocalypse, the limits of the apocalyptic thinking. Therefore, one of his books is entitled Against Apocalypse, Recovering Humanity's Wholeness. So his work spans almost last 6 decades, many important works, including such important works such as Polis and Praxis, and the other Heidegger, and Dialogues Among Civilizations, Democracy to Come, and many works. He has also edited a very important book series called Border Crossing, and that is an attempt in comparative political philosophy. In fact, Professor Dallmayr has been a kind of founder of the field of comparative political philosophy, because most of the political philosophy in the Euro-American world has been mostly limited to the Euro-American universe of thinking. And Professor Dallmayr has really invited people from different parts of the world, South America, China, India. He has really traveled and met with people in these different parts of the world. So what we call as planetary conversations, that is rooted planetary conversations wherever we are, and then we learn together with many different. Professor Dallmayr is an exemplary embodiment of that. For example, he has collaborated with friends in India, the noted thinker and activist Ganesh Devi. Years ago, they edited a book on Indian
But your voice is breaking. Sorry, sir. Professor Giri, sir. Hello. Professor Giri, sir, your voice is breaking. Hello. Professor Giri, am I audible to you? Okay. Okay, so I think we lost his connection. So meanwhile, I would like to invite Dr. Professor John Clammer. Am I audible to you, sir?
Yes.
Yes,
Let me
please.
turn myself back on.
You can continue. I will. Meanwhile, I'm connecting with Professor Giri again. Okay.
Okay. So something is wrong with the connection. Sorry.
Yes.
Zoom is not responding.
So I would request you to kindly give your presentation so that.
Yes, at the moment I can't see anybody. My Zoom is not.
Okay. So you can again, first exit and then come again. Meanwhile, I would invite Dr. Edwin George, sir, to kindly give his presentation.
Yes, namaste. Good evening to everybody. I hope I am audible. Okay.
Yes, sir, you are audible loud and clear.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. Anyway, until we get back the connections of Professor Giri and Professor Clammer, and I hope I can just start presenting it. And I'm just trying to be um, really put myself in the situation of this webinar on post-secular dialogues. It's very, very fitting and most deserving tribute to Professor Frederick Reinhard Dallmayr. Okay, before I begin to talk about the things that really have been so much of interest to me and my field of research and study, I just want to make a presentation. Professor Randhir, can I do a slide presentation?
Sure, sir, you can do.
Yeah, okay. So it says disabled share. I think you have to enable my sharing.
Okay, just wait a minute. Now you can share your screen.
Yeah, okay. Just very briefly, I will give you my association with Professor, then I will come to the content. So this is kind of sharing that I want to make of Professor Dallmayr, which we know about or what we know about. Okay, can you see this? Can you see the screen? My
Yes,
screen?
sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So I just want to happily remember, as he's still alive and active and very much sharp in mind over there in his hometown in Illinois. Okay. And right now I feel honored to be presenting him. Um, this is a basic honor. And I just wanted to show you how this has been truly a kind of thing. When I met him in 2009, I presented him with an Indian shawl and a great emblem of national, Indian national thing, the Ashoka pillar, no, with the thing, and he was so happy, and he knows the meaning of that. Okay, there was back in 2009, and my work has been on the study of Dallmayr's contribution, particularly presenting his areas of so much interest, politics, culture, and ethics together, as I would call a transformative philosophy. So this is what I would actually, I've done my research and work, and afterwards presented very many theme papers after that. And this is what you see the picture, my humble self with great erudite scholar and learner of the present age, Professor Dallmayr, in his office in Notre Dame University, where I spend, as Professor Giri said, 2 weeks with him every day to spend nearly 8 hours talking to him, listening to him, sharing with him, and recording all that he said, and also giving my opinion and all that. And my presentation is going to be today simple as this, all right? Introducing Dallmayr as a political philosopher. And I'm not giving a slide program, but I'll make very small and very clear kind of sharing on these subtopics. As a transformative philosophy of Dallmayr, I would like to introduce him as a political philosopher and how he shown himself into starting his career into law, actually. Then he moved on to politics and then political philosophy. And then he went on to write so many things in terms of intercultural, cross-cultural elements. As Professor Giri said, having traveled so many countries, and he was able to present this so beautifully cross-cultural content. And I will tell you why that is it. And then what does mean by transformation? How did he really get this idea of transformation? Or maybe why am I projecting it on him? But I just ran through all his writings from the beginning and from 1978 onwards. And then I saw the way in which this transformative idea was blossoming forth. So I would like to talk about that. And finally, about the transformative applications that are very relevant for today, and especially in the post-secular age. So this is my very brief kind of presentation. All right. So the next thing that I really wanted to just bring that notion here is um, basically um, before I really begin the way in which I want to do it, I want to really thank and appreciate the convener, Randhir Kumar Gautam from Raffles University in Neemrana, and my fellow speakers, Professor John Clammer, wonderful, whose writings I've also read and so much admire, from Jindal Global University, and our own good professor and who coordinates with all of us, and the moderator, Professor Ananda Kumar Giri from MITS Chennai, and all online participants and all listeners. Good evening to you all once again. And I want to appreciate these efforts in these dialogues, post-secular dialogues, taken by these groups along with the Swadhyaya as well as Vishwanidham. And thank you. This is a beautiful experience for me as well. And I'm happy to be here. So,
Thank you.
yes, and I just want to ask you, Professor Andy, how many minutes will I have? Can I know this, please? Do I have how many minutes do I have?
Yes, yes, you have 30 minutes, sir. You have
Okay.
30 minutes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. All right. Anyway, I think by my accident, I'm by preceding Professor Giri and the great Professor Clammer. I feel very humble, but then I just want to go ahead with that for the opportunity online. Okay, so let me just begin in talking with terms of what is this transformation at all, you know, and what I'm presenting here is reading all the writings of Dallmayr, his research articles, his publications, and his books and chapters and books, all that. So it has been a study for me over almost 4.5 years, that particular time. And now if I have to present that as a transformative philosophy, what do you mean and understand? And I just begin with the famous phrase in Greek, thaumazein. Thaumazein is a philosophical wandering. And that philosophical wandering actually engaged me, especially to talk about change and the basic philosophical question, why there is change at all. And therefore, to attempt to answer this, I perceive this change as very essential and continuous, real, and sometimes enforced in all areas of knowledge and experience. And therefore, philosophy terms change as the terms maybe growth, or we say in economical term development, or in appropriately change is transformation. So that is why growth indicates development and transformation indicates a fundamental change. So I'm talking in terms of transformative philosophy to all of you. And you want to see what is transformation? Just look at the streets now. The amount of demonstrations, open demonstration for freedom of speech, for religious practices, for work of the farmers and different movements. And everybody wants to be recognized and identified. And there you see that all that they are doing is crying out to the nation heads, leaders, and rulers of kingdoms, elected representatives, and governing officials, and religious heads to listen to them. And therefore, why? Because they want to change. They want to change in all aspects, whether it's religion or a state or in a society or an organization. Everybody wants a change. But however, such a world requires transformation of the political, economic, religious, social structures in the world that we live today, and then we inhabit, and then we leave it for posterity. And therefore, this transformative philosophy of Fred Dallmayr is a very interesting aspect. And as you know, you will see how the meaning and the element will come through. The first thing that I wanted to present here is, what is this transformation? How will you define or how will you understand this term transformation? In in a Dallmayrian sense, I'll come to later. But right now, I would like to say, I've just taken a kind of definition from by a journal by name Swedia, in which Jose Elembasari mentions this very clearly like this. A transformative philosophy is an ongoing search, an attempt to garner the deep, agnostic, and reflective perspectives or responses to the world. And if I have to put that into transformative philosophy of Dallmayr, then it is a transformative engagements for a better living in the global community. So that's what I would like to present here. And in that case, the word transformation, again, I tell you, it means radical or a fundamental change. And philosophy means a kind of reflective living. So let's keep these two things together to understand what Dallmayr goes about. And the first thing I want to tell you is Dallmayr began his career in legal aspects, in law firms, because having studied and obtained doctorate in legalities, in law. But then, as he studied law, he was able to crisscross the political aspects. And therefore, when he picked up the political aspects, he entered into studying political science. But then he realized political science is rather inadequate. And therefore, he elaborated or enlarged his field of study and writing to political philosophy. And that is why right now in the field of political philosophy, he was infusing hermeneutics aspect of it. For him, political philosophy is not mere interpretation of text or situation, but it is a quality of being an universal human condition. In other words, if this can be applied to nation state or global perspective, then understanding should be concerned with what is happening around us. So politics is not hanging in the air. It is what is happening around us. And Dallmayr was able to boldly insert himself in the ongoing debates or issues of conflict, such as dogmatism against relativism, subjectivity versus objectivity, modernity pitted in opposition to postmodernity, and so on. And you see that dynamics between them. And therefore, he was trying to reformulate modernity without losing its strength. No, without losing its strength means like what they talked about, freedom, technology, rationality, and all that. But at the same time, doing away with the weakness of modernity, namely too much of rationality or exclusivity or domination kind of thought. So his thought on politics in relation to the prevalent linguistic turn was to see the political relevance and discover that language and politics are always the modes of giving. And according to him, politics becomes a practical activity of communication and greatly contributes towards meaningful relationship. You see, he looks at politics as a kind of communicative mode of acting and being. And therefore, next, with pragmatic turn, he replaced epistemological metaphysical concept undertakings to practical concerns, pragmatic practical concerns. And that is what I call a kind of transformation. In Greek, we can say it is a periagoge, or in German, they will say Wendung, a kind of very important aspect of a change. And that runs through Heideggerian notion of practical ontology. And also, even it refers earlier to Merleau-Ponty as well. In this sense, Dallmayr placed his thought on politics as an action, handling, praxis. And in a way, it actually resonates Aristotelian sense, politics as a learning of practice or practice of friendship, that he is inculcated into his writing. In this effort, Dallmayr also employs a German term or word called Bildung. Very interesting term. It's got rich meaning, but literally building can be building or something built, but it is actually means is formation, cultivation. It means like that. And therefore, in that sense, he draws inspiration from Gadamer to say that politics is a formation or cultivation to maturity for contributing towards polis. From there, Dallmayr directed his political theory efforts to move from polis to cosmopolis. And I'll come to that when I talk to you about cross-cultural elements. And therefore, here is where we see Dallmayr's pressed very beautifully. In spite of all hegemony, in spite of all terrorism, and sometimes even unilateralism and monopolization, the Dallmayr moves into terms of understanding, dialogue, correction, reconciliation in politics. You can imagine that. And therefore, in a way, I say that in order to be rooted in philosophizing his political expedition, Dallmayr sought to clarify for himself with a very basic understanding of the original texts of Hegel, Heidegger, Habermas, Gadamer, and also the rich and prevalent thoughts of schools of Freiburg and Frankfurt. And in this, what he did was he constantly engaged in dialogue with them, with those schools, with those thinkers. And from that, he was able to bring a political theory. And he enunciated very unlike political theory of Hegel's transformative of political life, Heidegger's transformative quality of estrangement, and Habermas' universal pragmatics for the theory of communicative action. In fact, the Dallmayr, along with another author, written about communicative action very beautifully in a book. And therefore, if you understand political thought of Dallmayr this way, it is not in any way independent entity. For Dallmayr, it is an interwoven aspect, that is politics, along with cultural and ethical. Or rather, he looks at the politics as an interplay between culture and ethics as well. That is why, from purely being political science, he was able to go to political philosophy. And as Professor Giri said, he was a pioneer in America for comparative political philosophy and theory. And then you see in that political aspects, he was able to bring in cross-cultural elements, and that always encouraged learning and dialogue, And in spite of all the devastations of World War and threatening nuclear war and chemical warfare, he was able to travel widely and engage himself in dialogue among civilizations. And that is a kind of very keep lot of difference that it was between Christian West and Muslim East and a kind of Indian Eastern thought. He was able to take a lot of rich notions from there. And therefore, taking into account strong voice of politics of multiculturalism, Dallmayr, in line with the thought of Iris M. Young, talked in terms of democratic cultural pluralism, or he calls it democratic multiculturalism. What does it mean? How does he understand these type of concepts? And if you journey along with Dallmayr, you'll know that is, he endorses cultural difference with a transitive, transformative, and emancipatory mode. So it is not in a judgmental aspect, it is in relational aspect, it is in communicative aspect. That is very beautiful. And therefore, this concern both democracy and the urgent to undergo transformation or educational formation for responsible ethics of humanity. You see, so politics has necessarily to be concerned with ethics of humanity. And therefore, the need for politics to be engaged with ethical and have never been compromised by Dallmayr. He advocated virtue ethics as a practical, everyday practice of virtue in polis and cosmopolis, in nation state and global city, in Aristotelian Hegelian senses. The concerns for democracy is not mere notion in Dallmayr writings. So when he talks in terms of democracy and the promise of democracy, in fact, one of his books is Promise of Democracy. And in that particular talking political aspect, his writings are always a transformative reality and very close to his art, and in the form of return to democracy, not in an imposing manner, but in a democratic way of attentiveness to the common good. This is exactly the kernel of his thoughts in political philosophy, in concern for nation state and the democratic form of government. He has been always advocating very beautifully an attentiveness to the common good in a gentle and sensitive way. And then you find after his sojourn to Eastern countries, and in 84, when he came to India, 1984, he came to India as a Fulbright scholar, and he traveled the several universities in India. And then he was able to see there is much more in philosophy than mere Western thought. And Eurocentric thought is inadequate. He was able to feel that. And that is the reason the subcontinent, India, with his varieties of culture and civilization, Dallmayr was able to understand uniqueness of his learning mutually. And in fact, he learned Sanskrit and he learned Vedas and interacted with many Indian scholars and dialogued many Muslim thinkers here. And then he started writing jointly and even putting together as a kind of an impact of his own visit. And therefore, his non-Western interests, if I can call it, enabled him to enter into cross-cultural and comparative mode of doing political philosophy. You see, now we are moving into cross-cultural aspects of his philosophy. So from comparative studies, he discovered comparative philosophy in association with the enterprise happening in the society for Asian and comparative philosophy in Hawaii. Okay, he discovered that comparative philosophy or cross-cultural global philosophy was ahead in comparative studies than political science or political philosophy. And therefore, he met the leading philosophers in this field, such as Deutsch and John Bigben, then Rosemont, and also Mohanty. And he was able to meet them in Hawaii, and he was able to talk to them and relate with them and interact with them. And then he learned a lot about Chinese philosophy, Taoism, Confucianism, then Jainism, and a lot about Buddhism, and so much. And when I talked to him in Illinois about this visit and learning about Chinese philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, he was so eloquent, and he was able to really breathe that kind of thing. And therefore, Dallmayr felt that move from comparative political theory to comparative political philosophy was very late, and the political theory was getting outdated. And therefore, in that, he pioneered and made a strong impact into comparative political philosophy. And one of his books very beautifully engages in dialogue with Western thought, Eastern thought, Indian, Buddhist, Chinese, and South American, African thoughts beautifully as a kind of a real effect for thinking in the global level. In spite of all these bold ventures and movements, for comparative thought from the Indian, Chinese, Buddhist, Muslim cultures is entered into American political philosophy. And he broke the highly safeguarded Western canon and is monopolizing trend. In a mode of learning that would be mutually beneficial, he worked out a dialogical or cross-cultural enterprise, overcoming the dichotomy between doxa and praxis, that, the theory and action. Hence, he advocated cross-cultural dialogical encounters, which would enable theories and students, I'm sure there are some students here, also you learn, that cross-cultural dialogue, that encounter made him be very relevant, in fact, not only of his time, even now for us in our time. He became a pioneer in comparative political philosophy in America and changed in every seminar, every conference, in every panel that he was there to bring into this cross-cultural elements and dialogical forms of doing philosophy. And that is why in 1999, he wrote the book Border Crossing Towards a Comparative Political Theory, very beautiful book if you can get that book and read comparative. And then later on, comparative political theory and indirection. That's a kind of a real textbook for political sciences and political philosophy and comparative political philosophy. Very beautiful book about making their comparative as a kind of an more than a near comparison, but universal, global, dialogical aspect of it. In other words, in his new field of political science, is a dialogical in terms of culture and language, in terms of culture and language as well. Therefore, comparative political philosophy is a need of the hour in the process of transformation of much dispirited political ethos, even now. Okay, even now I feel, even in India for that matter, comparative political philosophy will be a beautiful arena to engage and also to move ahead in action. And therefore, I just want to say from here how this notion of transformation comes into the idea of from Dallmayr and his writings, and especially in talking about nation state or democracy and all that. Okay, in fact, just would quote one. Dallmayr says in one place, by democracy or democratic principles, I do not mean merely formal procedures or legal safeguards, but rather the effective chance of people around the world to engage in political participation and will formation, and thus to exert their capabilities. And that is why He was able to move from absolute democracy to from the time of old, liberal democracy, social democracy, deliberate democracy, procedural democracy, religious democracy, and pluralist democracy to cosmopolitan democracy, which slowly comes out in his ideas and thought. And just a kind of notion, when I met him in Illinois University of Notre Dame, he was so open to even dialogue with me, not in just of politics, but even as aspect of culture and ethics. And that kind of, an openness we find only in a erudite scholar and learner, always willing to learn. In fact, in his writing, the traces of thought from Asian, African, and Latin American thinkers really bore him a lot of fruitful dialogue. And the dialogue is not simple, not seen as a simple ego alter ego interaction, but rather as an encounter between mutually descended agents involved in a transformative event or learning process. In fact, when I was learning from him, he was learning from me. So we have already presented and therefore understood the different way in which Dallmayr comes in and brings in this dialogical mode and cross-cultural elements in his writings and engagements. And that is a very beautiful aspect. And therefore, I would like to point out here just two small things with regard to democracy when he comes some thoughts as it in terms of transformation. Two aspects. First of all, with regard to the relation of ethics and politics as a need of transformation and transcendence for a sustained labor of formative maturation in a Gandhian sense to reduce himself to zero. That kind of subtlety, that kind of small wonder, that's exactly how we notioned it. Secondly, from the implication of multiculturalism is willingness to have a learning experience, which is a self-transformation. Like, for example, Charles Taylor will talk about this self-transformation. And in this group, this growing up like this, he was able to say transformation take place in a concrete experiences of suffering, exploitation, and domination. In this regard, Dallmayr wanted to include human rights be included in ethical democracy. He designated rights as good news, a protective shield, absolute and related human dignity. And we can see this very practically how it gave safeguard the democratic polity as an ethical mode. And that is why, as I said, political philosophy is not just more a kind of a form of government. It's not a question of just a kind of organization. No, it is so much interwoven with culture and ethics that Dallmayr was able to talk just like cosmopolitics, cosmopolis. He was able to talk about global ethics and global aspects. It is not a kind of a notion or a code, but as a dynamics of engagement and action. Very beautifully, he brings in his writings. And therefore, yeah, a lot more can be said. I'm just skipping that. Then bring a kind of a democracy is not mere true form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoined communicated experience, inventive effort and creative activity. Democracy is a form of government only because it's a form of moral and spiritual association. Look at that, okay, where in the promise of democracy said that. Okay, democracy is a form of government only because a form of moral and spiritual association. And in the same manner, Gandhian Swaraj, or self-rule, is also presented by Dallmayr as an ethical conception of democracy. Swaraj is a very interesting aspect of Swaraj when during the time of our freedom struggle, when Gandhi wrote and infused in every mind of the leaders and Indians, here we find an ethical conception of democracy contrasting with the interest-based models of liberal democracy. Gandhian path of politics of action, the Karma Yoga, is a continuous and ethical engagement. The affairs of the world by which Gandhi went beyond procedural or minimum democracy. Moreover, Gandhian Swaraj, with its stress on self-rule, is a transformative process. Once again, I bring the idea, okay? Dallmayr is able to bring the transformative process for the people themselves. The transformative self-rule democratic politics is non-domineering type of public agency, an agency captured by the Gandhian labels of non-violence, ahimsa, and satyagraha, truth force. Okay, here we find that this kind of an idea that is from Satyagraha, where beautifully it forms us, it forms me, it transforms me. Something like what Olin will talk about formative politics, or Charles Taylor will talk about democratic will formation. No, that is the Gandhian practical engagement of ethical plural democracy. And therefore, Dallmayr's concern had been moved away from the dominant libertarian democracy in America and vouch for practical engagement or participatory form of democracy in ethical path in the pluralistic context. This is endorsed very much by Dallmayr. Finally, I would like to also talk about transformative aspect. And so this, in all these aspects, why Dallmayr is engaging himself in political aspects, cultural aspects, and ethical aspects. Simply, he is moving towards the transformation. He's moving towards transformation. That is beautiful. And this is a vision. It's not just an idea. It's a vision, and a vision with a mission. Absolutely. And Fred Dallmayr, this vision is very broad-based strategy of application. And this vision is a long-term sight for transformation towards creating a better society, creating a common good. And therefore, creating a vision and implementing is a challenge in the human endeavor. And Dallmayr does that joyfully and has done it and relentless search and untiring journey, extraordinary scholarship, and sheer integrity is shown in his writings with the increasing magnitude of thought process and through intersubjective discourses, multilinguistic talent, cultural learning, sensitive interpretation, and warmth of friendship, and carries the seal of this man with a mission. Certainly, he has an alternative vision for our troubled times to make us beyond the ambience of war, segregation, ethnic conflicts, and division on basis of religion and whatever. Okay, and therefore, this is what it means transformative philosophy. And I would like to put this here as an alternative vision, which gives us philosophy as transformation. And alternatives look for newer approach or preferential choice for the possibility of reconciliation of contrasting elements. In certain cases, subtle interpretation of issues are undertaken by falling back on the older or traditional thinkers to enhance the possibility of the beyond. And therefore, here, to put it very differently, alternatives are neither antithesis nor synthesis, but synergy of the in-between, or the Aristotelian just mean, or a path of untrodden, or a vision beyond perception. This is what I say alternative vision of transformative philosophy is. It's good to recall here the explanation offered already, the notion of transformative philosophy. And I'm telling you, this transformation philosophy is thinking of based on the writings of Dallmayr and applied very beautifully into our land. To conclude, Dallmayr's presentation and his thinking are relevant, as we said, in this post-secular dialogical age, is because it's a practical engagement. Theoretical framework are geared towards practical enterprise. The task of political philosophy is quite unfinished. And therefore, in thinking and acting, we have to progress. And how do you apply that? The first application here is hermeneutical circle of understanding, a very important element for engaging oneself, with the prudential judgment, what they call in Greek phronosis. Very, very important. It's a kind of predicament that made Heidegger contribute to shift the role of hermeneutics from epistemology to ontology. A methodological shift from academic disciplines to the existential level of human beings in the world. That's sane. And this hermeneutical work is a midpoint between ontological tension of familiarity and strangeness. Therefore, the application here of transformative philosophies of the hermeneutical circle. It's an open circle, fostering the learning process of steady amelioration and transformation of understanding. Second application is humanism. In all his writings, there is so much with regard to the other. As a guardian, as a shepherd of being, as Heidegger would say, shepherd of being. Humanism in its transformative quality, a dual significance involving both the healing and salvaging of the world and the transfiguration of human agents of change. It's a very beautiful aspect. And third application is a practical engagement. I've been telling you how he was able to move from Frankfurt School away from phenomenology and the Freiburg School, and he was able to bring in the elements of, on the stress on worldliness, humanism, and kind of philosophical hermeneutic, which is engagement, practical aspect of truth in action. It means taking a stance, purely not a spectatorial stance. It's a support of responsible praxis, which is enabling and liberating the human elements, the human being, the human dignity, the human rights. So this is another application of transformative philosophy. The fourth one, it is redemptive non-sovereignty. That's a term I'm using from Dallmayr. You wrote in A Small Wonder that redemptive non-sovereignty is a kind of background of biblical conversation between Jesus and Pilate in the Gospel of John, chapter 18. Dallmayr concluded that Jesus never wanted to establish a counter regime to the prevailing political regime, the dominant Roman regime, but an alternative supreme potestas. No, the potestas of the provincial governor of imperial Rome. Jesus' life and ministry offered a genuine alternative to prevailing politics. That alternative was not based on competition or negation, nor on destruction, nor on domination, but on transformation, based on salvation, redemption through truth and grace. In political terms, Dallmayr continued Jesus' reflection like this. Jesus inaugurated neither a super politics nor anti-politics, but rather another kind of politics, concerning the other politics, called the politics of sacred or non-sovereignty. And this is a very beautiful thing, to talk about. And the fifth engagement is a pedagogy quality of formation. I told you already, the Bildung, the word Bildung. All along, Dallmayr was concerned about building up, cultivating, slowly getting to learn. And that aspect is taking from Heidegger's notion of to be human is to philosophize. To be human is to philosophize. And that we need to form ourselves. We have to form ourselves slowly and carefully. And, interpreting Heidegger Lord's sense, he brought about, I told you, that Umwendung, turning about, cultivation, formation. Dallmayr brought these notions to reiterate the quality of practical engagement of transformative philosophizing of human beings in and as democratic politics. And sixth one, very importantly, this transformative philosophy is also a struggle as suffering, because it starts with the sufferings and struggles of the helpless people, citizens and people. And it is against all kinds of dictatorship and monopoly and hegemony, and therefore he was referring to all that happened in South America, places like Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Honduras, Guatemala, all this he remembers and then says that cannot be a kind of win, but rather moving away from that, we are able to have peace and dialogue because we are starting with suffering. Transformative philosophy should engage with suffering so as to reconcile, to heal, and also to empower the people who are affected. And seventh one, last one, application is a cosmopolitanism. I told you, from polis to cosmopolis, from ethics to global ethics was his intention. And this envisaged cosmopolitanism is never intended to be equivalent to the world state. No, cosmopolitan is not in terms of another world state, like we find people finding new states, okay, all that, Kailasa and all that, not that way. It was suggested not as utopian agenda, but as a transformative politics, wherein which a new type of humanism, spearheading the advocacy of democracy, human rights, moral commitment of world peace and world governance. This global level bifocal political ethical venture is called transformative philosophy of practical engagement or commitment. And therefore, in this aspects, Dallmayr brings it very clearly. The agencies of transformation are religion, okay, very important, because religion is a very, very important aspect. Then culture, and then the state, nation head, and all other, even NGOs and practical groups, they are engaged with transformation in so many ways, even in small little ways, and that will bring dialogue, reconciliation, redemption. And therefore, finally, I want to conclude here. Transformative philosophy of Dallmayr, in which is a grassroots level approach, touching the common man. And it is against all kind of dictatorial elements, and that if it is coming with sublime element, and therefore it is no way monopoly of truth, but it is openness to truth. And Dallmayrian transformative mode of philosophizing is a very important bifocal, or in Panik's term, you say bipolar. and enterprise on the axis are two trajectories. Politics and ethics should go on together. And this sounds as a very important element for us to understand this aspect of Dallmayr. And in articulating transformative philosophy of Dallmayr is concretely situated in two senses. The first sense is the practical ethical engagement. The second sense is the born out agonal hermeneutics, as I told you, meeting out, pointing out justices and sufferings and moving into action. And they are very concrete. And this agnostic move centers the struggles, sufferings, and pain that serve the higher purpose of rectification, and therefore paves the way for reconciliation and healing and development, or we say transformation. And this is a healing and salvaging enterprise. And for me, I also feel that it's a very beautiful enterprise because we need justice that heals rather than justice that kills. This is indeed a transformative philosophy par excellence. And I commit myself and offer this effort in explanation this particular the mind and thought and writings of Dallmayr to Professor Dallmayr himself on the eve of his 93rd birthday. Happy birthday, Professor Dallmayr, and we all admire you and we still learn from you. And thank you, all the participants, the listeners. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. George. Thank you so much for beautiful invocation of Dallmayr's ideas as an emancipatory thinker. You have touched almost all important philosophical dimensions of his vision, concepts, and methodology. The beauty of Dallmayr is that is beautifully connect intercultural ideas and intercultural concept for that matter. Concepts like integral pluralism, how deep concept it is. Concept like civic virtues, ethics. Right? So thank you so much for beautifully invocation of his ideas, be it mutual learning, civic pedagogy. Thank you so much, sir. Now I would like to invite Professor John Clammer. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Randhir. Sorry about the little, I also lost my Zoom a few minutes ago, so it all seems to be back again now. So thank you again for the invitation to participate in this wonderful series of usually Sunday meetings, which have covered so many extraordinarily interesting topics. And I don't know if Professor Dallmayr will have a chance to hear the recording. I hope you will, of our little event tonight, in which case, again, I extend my warmest felicitations to him on his 93rd birthday tomorrow. Very happy birthday, Professor Dallmayr. I think we've only met once, as I recall. I'm sure I'd recall if there was more than once. And if Professor Dallmayr is listening, I'm sure he's forgotten. In Busan, in South Korea, probably 10 years ago, at a series of meetings that were organized by UNESCO, particularly the Korean office of UNESCO, where we were both speakers. So at that time, I worked for the UN and was very much involved in the relations between my own agency, the UN University, and UNESCO. So that was another rich experience. So it's a pleasure. Now, unlike Father Eddie, I don't think I've read everything that Professor Dallmayr wrote. Right? So I haven't made a specific study of his work. But then when I look through my own writings, I find all over the place references to him here and there. And I was looking in the index of a couple of books I have with me here, as I'm not in India at this moment. And indeed, he showed up, of course, in the index of all of those books from one or other of that remarkable range of production. And when I first discovered his work, and what kept me engaged constantly with it were, in fact, many of the issues that Father Eddie has beautifully framed for us, I think. But were a number of other things too, which I would like to elaborate on in the next few minutes. Early in the paper that Ananta sent to us, as I think if he comes back online, I'm sure will be the contribution he will make. Ananta likes to talk about his learning journey, and I got the impression just now that he was actually in a vehicle. So I think he's literally moving. So I hope we can recover him at some point. But he uses the word wholeness. I think a very important word, and a little different perhaps from just the notion of holism that is now widely used in the social sciences, for example. You know, we must try and integrate, and I think this is correct. We should try and integrate, you know, the various disciplines as they've grown up historically into a more complete picture of social reality. That is true, but I think there's another wider meaning to this word wholeness, which is capturing something more fundamental about the human condition. Now, I'm sure Fred Dallmayr has never thought of himself as an existentialist, but existentialism in one sense, of course, I don't know that it really kept to that vision, was an attempt to grasp the actual nature of human being. Again, Father Eddie's invoked Heidegger several times, of course, so the notion of being as a central idea that needs serious unpacking, serious thinking about, and serious engagement with, because it's that curious phenomenon that we're living it, but yet we don't fully understand what we are living. And to begin to try to decode that practice of living, I think is a very significant aspect of Fred Dallmayr's work. I don't know if he considers it that way himself or would read it that way, but I think this is certainly one way he can be read. You know, I find myself when I'm in India in an institution, many of us have probably found the same thing of you know, for all its many, many virtues, with an academic culture, which is becoming more and more managerial, more and more measuring things, measuring citations, measuring how many papers you've published in a journal which is listed on the great sacred index of Scopus, right? And you get your brownie points if you've done those things. If you write a wonderful book, it's not listed on Scopus, you don't get any brownie points. You know, there's been, I think, a tendency in the last few years, it's not only true of India, I think this is a global phenomenon, to narrow itself to an increasingly analytical and rigid approach, reflected, I think, in that kind of philosophy that what really counts is the publication in a journal which is somehow regarded as peer-reviewed, all of these kinds of things. Now, this has its virtues, obviously, because it hopefully weeds out second-class work. You know, it prevents all sorts of nonsense ever reaching the printed page and then us wasting time reading it. But it has another effect too, which is that it, I think, narrows the way in which we approach the world through our various academic disciplines to something which does not, in fact, capture anything like the wholeness of being. Now, in fact, I must admit to myself at this moment, and it didn't occur to me until just literally this moment, I don't know what field Professor Dallmayr officially belongs to. Is he in theology, philosophy, sociology, ethics, somewhere in between? I don't know. And the point is, I don't care, precisely because I think his work represents the breaking of those boundaries, the ability to expand far beyond the narrowness of a great deal of academic discourse into actually addressing what are the core issues, or many of the core issues of human life. And what I think is remarkable about his scholarly output across his career has been the fact that it's always been a philosophy of process. That is to say, I think in two senses. One is his own philosophy is not a set of rigid categories then imposed on the world, but process also in the sense that, of course, the world itself, in a sense, is a moving target. One of his most recent books, of course, is about ecology or about the environment, Return to Nature. I imagine at the time he started writing, the whole question of climate change and these issues which are now at the forefront of discussion were not really on the agenda in the way in which they are now. But yet we find this trajectory, which is in a sense, I think, let me put it the other way around. I think if you want to know what's happened in the last 3 or 4 decades, one way you could find out would be to read Fred Dallmayr's work, because it will tell you, in a sense, it will signal to you what, in fact, are, if you like, the deep preoccupations, not simply the surface questions, what lies below them. And I think that is an essential quality of his work that we should try and grasp. And I think those of us who are also, at least in part, committed to that style of work itself, should indeed maintain that. We should defend that approach against the narrowing of disciplines to a kind of technical, highly professional kind of phenomenon. I mean, I'm a sociologist. Sociology is not too bad. We're often accused of writing in jargon. But I find now if I open a major economics journal, I can't understand what the authors are saying. Not only because the math is far too advanced for me, I've never gone that far in my math, okay, but because the whole way they're framing questions about the world are such that they don't seem to speak to the actual kind of experience that one has and experiences when actually facing the world. So I think the ability to face the world and to distill many of its qualities and reflect them back to us in writing has been, in fact, one of Fred Dallmayr's major achievements, and a lasting one. You know, as I've read him, I mean, of course, I'm very aware of his background and his kind of history, but I could easily have mistaken him for an Asian philosopher. Not only because of the factors that Father Eddie has just pointed out to us, right? That he did and has deeply engaged with Asian philosophy in very practical ways. I hadn't realized that he'd, attempted learning Sanskrit, something I've been promising myself for years and never actually got around to yet, right? Perhaps this will inspire me to do that, all right? So I've often thought, if you know Chinese, Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, you've more or less got the world covered in terms of its kind of major philosophical traditions, right? But I mean that in another sense, that not only has he, referred to or written about or reflected on, as it were, an outsider on many aspects of Asian philosophy, Chinese as well as Indian, but in a sense, he's absorbed it, I think, into himself in a way which I think is remarkable. People these days are often accused of some kind of appropriation. I've gone to a field of study or a field of performance, a field of whatever it would be. I found wonderful ideas there, and I've simply represented them in a sense as my own. I've borrowed from them without really acknowledging their source. Now, this, of course, is not the case with Dallmayr's work, far from it. I think he's genuinely absorbed those traditions, the cross-cultural that Father Eddie talked about, the comparative, not simply as a set of slogans, but as an integral way. And I think that notion of integral attitude to the world is a fundamental quality of his work, and one I think that gives it its richness, as well as its constant relevance, actually, as we see the world advance, revolving in so many ways, politically, socially, in terms of media and all these things around us. Only about, is it 2 or 3 weeks ago, Randhir, you can remind me, I was very kindly invited to give one of the Chittaranjan Das Memorial Lectures. And I remember in that lecture at some point talking about the way one of the things that always impressed me about Chittabai's work is that he was someone who could listen, was a deep listener. We often talk about the word dialogue, which I think is often sometimes simply an excuse for the idea that we are engaged in a argument. I've come to you with a fairly fixed position. I'm prepared to listen to you. I'm not really starting out at the beginning with the assumption that I might change that position. But in a genuine dialogue, as in a genuine conversation, of course, that is always a possibility, a very real possibility. And it's in fact not, I think, so much a threatening possibility as an exciting one, because it means we are always potentially exposed to new discoveries. I think probably in the way in which scientists approach the world, with the possibility always of another breakthrough into some hitherto unseen field of interest. In the social sciences in particular, I don't think we often think that way. We sort of more or less assume we know what's going on, when in fact, I don't think we do. That's partly because we're not necessarily open to the possibility of being surprised and actually radically changing our mind as a result of that kind of surprise. There are other issues too. some wit is supposed, I don't know who it was, if was a true attribution, some wit is once supposed to have said, the modern university teaches you everything you need to know except the really important things. And one of the books on my bookshelf by Fred Dallmayr is his book on peace talks. But what was the phrase? But who would listen? I don't have the copy right in front of me now. But who listens? Yeah, peace talks, but who listens, right? Now, it surprised me that in the area of peace studies, which one would think would be a central discipline, possibly along with something like today, environmental studies. In my own university, all the students, certainly in my school at OP Jindal University, are obliged to take a course in environmental studies, amongst other things. In their first year, that's one of the required courses. It might be not a bad idea if students were also exposed to peace studies early on in their, many of us pay lip service to Gandhiji, and then pass on to talk about other things without really assimilating that. Now, I was just running through my mind a little while earlier, trying to think of how many universities I know that actually have a course in peace studies. And the answer is very, very few, very, very, very few. It's a handful. And I think Dallmayr has drawn our attention to one of the great silences of, in a sense, academic life. It's easy to talk about human rights. It's easy to talk about issues of that kind, which sound somehow more committed, in that sense of slightly engaged quality that it seems to give your work when you use those kind of words. The word peace sounds a little soft, perhaps a little bourgeois, a little flaky in some kind of way, when clearly it's not only because it's so central to the successful running of any society, but because I think one of the great disappointments, in a sense, of the post-Cold War world, you think back to 1989 or 1990, when I think many people thought this was going to, in fact, enter, and lead us into a new world of, if not complete tranquility, at least with the old hostilities having died away. In fact, empirically, as we know, that's exactly not what has happened. In fact, there are probably more conflicts in process somewhere in the world, whether wars, civil conflict, one kind or another, than any time in the very recent past. It's true, we have not fortunately experienced a world war since 1945, but we've experienced huge numbers of other kinds of conflicts, many, many kinds. But yet the real engagement with that subject is somehow missing from so much of our discourse, particularly in the university settings. And I think Dallmayr has drawn our attention back to the fact that this should be recentered. And I think it also bears on the question that Father Eddie raised, notably the question about democracy. Democracy, we can see in many ways, is under pressure around the world. Those who have monitored these kinds of things, of course, give alarming figures. In East Europe, all over the place, we find endless examples now of authoritarian regimes emerging. We saw just a year ago in the United States, an attack on democracy at the very place that sees itself as being the flagship of democracy. That's partly, I think, because as Dallmayr rightly points out, if we associate democracy purely with its institutional forms, it doesn't take us very far. It's desirable, obviously, that people have a voice in the way in which decisions are made. But I think he's fundamentally right when he points to the fact that the basis of a true democracy is, in fact, ethics. It's ethics in a collective and social sense, not only in the individual sense certainly, but in a collective sense, in that it requires us to listen to one another. It requires us to debate openly alternatives, and which of those alternatives would be, the most viable, the most acceptable. It involves us, in fact, in making decisions not only about human rights, but also about responsibilities. What is the other side of power? And to talk about politics only in terms of power, of course, is to miss so many of its really essential dimensions. One of the ideas which certainly lurks in Fred Dallmayr's work, therefore, is this notion, I think, of political theology. The notion, again, of rethinking the relationship between, the secular and the divine, however you want to phrase it, and bringing back into discussion the question of when I was a student, when I was a graduate student, the theory of secularization was one of the major theories propagated by some of my teachers. You know, religion would disappear largely from the world. It would become simply a vestigial thing. You know, scientific rationality would drive out religion. You know, we look back on it as, you know, interesting phenomenon of the past, but something we, in a sense, outgrown. Now, as we know empirically, of course, exactly the opposite has happened. Religion has come back empirically in all sorts of forms, some not very desirable, some extremely fundamentalist, some dangerous, others have opened up a space for the exploration of different forms of spirituality, for example, which have, I think, drawn people back to rethinking the world in terms of a spiritual approach, not simply a material approach. And that itself is transformative when we begin to realize that there are, in fact, alternative ways of thinking the world. And if we grasp those, this, I think, points us to one of the important ideas in Fred Dallmayr's work, which is the notion of the kind of reconstructive hermeneutics. That's important, I think, not only because, you know, the study of hermeneutics, the study of attempting to understand, to develop models of understanding, as well as just analysis, is important, but because a lot of hermeneutic thinking is essentially deconstructive. And again, correctly up to a point, of course, right? You think back to ideas like critical theory in the Frankfurt School, or as it's operated in, particularly in sociology, this is extremely important. But the danger with a purely deconstructive hermeneutics, of course, is that having cleared the ground, we don't know what to build on it. And indeed, as we know, this has been the story of so many revolutions, that having, in fact, quite rightly in some cases, identified the problems that are blocking issues of social justice, of access, indeed of democracy, having swept away those institutions and those patterns of political and social organization, what has been put in their place has not always been anything like the really desired alternative that people were dreaming of, whether that was purely a utopian idea or whether, in fact, there were many practical ideas about how society might be rethought and reorganized. The idea of a reconstructive hermeneutics, I think, therefore, is a profoundly important idea, because what it points us to is the calling to engage actually in alternative thinking, of reconstructive work that points the way beyond the apocalypse. I think the use of that word recently in Dallmayr's work, of course, it's not an accident, he used it obviously very consciously, is actually well chosen in some ways. As a sociologist, I read a lot of comparative material, I read a lot of comparative literature, and there is a great deal of thinking going on arising from indigenous communities in Latin America and other places who are seriously talking about apocalypse. This is the end of the world as we know it, right? It could be a transition to a disastrous situation of barbarism, if not the end of civilization as we know it, something close to that. We're at, I think, at this moment, this incredible historical moment that we should grasp if we are willing to do that work, and it's quite hard work, is to rethink what that future might be like. Not only in purely science fiction terms, utopian terms, but in terms of really thinking about how we get from here to the kind of sustainable future that we would like to live in. And I think that underlying an awful lot of Fred Dallmayr's work has been exactly that pattern of thinking, pointing us beyond deconstruction, important as it is, to what might lie beyond it. And I think across the range of his work, of course, he's used different words to refer to what that future might look like, whether it's the word peace, whether it's the word democracy, whether it's the word ethics, listening, dialogue. They all, I think, point to that process. The French Catholic thinker Simone Weil, some of you may be familiar, one of her writings, she said something to the effect that she was a very interesting woman, contemporary of Jean-Paul Sartre and that generation of remarkable French thinkers at the time, has actually said, I can't remember the exact words or exactly how to translate it now, but to the effect that the most exciting thing you can do in the world now is to set out on this path of reconstruction, the reconstructive, to take the idea of reconstructive hermeneutics from its place, if you like, in the academy and its translation into forms of practice, which are not necessarily like, as Dr. Eddy has also just said, not necessarily like the previous forms of politics. That to be trapped in our old categories at a time when we're seeing the kind of birth of a new world, for good or worse, is very dangerous. You know, backward thinking is so common, and therefore the proposed changes to the future or policy interventions in the future are more or less the old stuff recycled into some new package. I think we've probably passed the point at which that works. You know, business as usual is really no longer the option. And so I would say in conclusion that when we look at the range of Fred Dallmayr's work, we find something very interesting. We find something which is not overtly political. That is to say, he's not banging a drum for the revolution, you know, waving a flag, red, black, what green, whatever color it might be, in any obvious sense. But underlying that is actually something more fundamental and something more subtle, more fundamental because it's more subtle, which is pointing us back to the very issue with which I started, which is the recovery of wholeness and the identification of the key existential issues with which we should engage if our work is to be relevant. And for those of us in universities, for example, if we're to drag the university from being, you know, busy, noisy, active, but actually, in a sense, irrelevant to the creation of that new world, to the process of becoming something transformative. So let me end with that thought, and simply with the idea that I think it's very fundamentally the case that, you know, to read Dallmayr is in fact a kind of revolutionary activity, right? Not in the obvious sense, but precisely in the sense that by uncovering the deep structures of our lives and being, we get closer to the identification of what we would like. And then we can think about how we might get there. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation.
Oh, Ananta is back.
Yes, Professor Giri has joined.
All right.
So thank you, John. I had, the last fields of your wise engagement, and I missed Eddie. So Randhir, if there is a bit of time, I can just join in a bit of the thoughts I had prepared. Is it okay?
Yes. Okay. I will share it. Okay. Yes.
So even with and beyond the PPT, dear friends, especially John and Eddie, I'm sorry for this little gift of disconnection. But in a way, this is in tune with the path of Professor Fred Dallmayr, who is a walker. And as John was pointing to, his engagement with political theology, and that political theology is really nurtured by a very different kind of journey, which is a spiritual walking, and the whole journey of wholeness, recovery of wholeness that John was, gifting us from Dallmayr. And that gift of wholeness is also accompanied by another, engagement of Professor Dallmayr called Integral Pluralism. And he has a book with that title, that Integral Pluralism, which brings us to his contribution to rethinking development as also integral. Integral in terms of going beyond varieties of oppositions between the secular society. Dallmayr's work has touched many dimensions that John has pointed to some of his works. He has a book called Alternative Visions, by a sense of the ethical. And Professor Dallmayr has this line that the democracy to come is going to come with our democratic practice. Therefore, what is going to come is really nurtured by what we do at the present. Since our theme is on the post-secular, I do not know whether my respected panelists have touched upon this issue, that the whole discourse of the post-secular in the last 15-20 years has been very much with the thought of Jürgen Habermas, who challenged us. He began with a sense of the secular, both reason and kind of unease with the religious construction of the world. But he himself, nurtured, he himself invited us to cultivate dialogue between the religious and the secular. And he said that the public sphere, if it does not invite the language of the religious, then it becomes impoverished. And especially at the contemporary juncture, the public sphere and political society also has a need to listen to different kind of religious articulations of the world and the themes that are at hand. And the famous dialogue between Habermas and then, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who became the Pope, the dialogue between Cardinal Ratzinger and Habermas, very interesting dialogue in 2004, in which the critical philosopher Habermas acknowledges what he calls is the pathology of reason, and Ratzinger, the Cardinal, then becoming Pope, he acknowledges the pathology of religion. So therefore, both of them acknowledging the pathology of religion and reason, then we have to move towards recovery, healing that John was pointing to, reconstructive hermeneutics. And this is also an engagement of Dallmayr, that the pathology of the religion calls for spiritual reconstruction and dialogue among religions. And in fact, dialogue among philosophical traditions. Unfortunately, that pathway have not been cultivated to that extent by either the Pope stream, the Christian stream, or the critical philosophy stream. But in Fred Dallmayr, we see an embodiment of that kind of not only globalization of dialogue, but a sense of planetarization. The distinction between the global and the planetary is that the global is too much, as John was pointing to, being trapped within our conventional modes of thinking. The global is very much within, for example, a colonial mode, and Dussel and building on Henrik Dussel, Dallmayr is deeply. So therefore, with Fred Dallmayr, I wish to suggest we are the Habermasian genealogy of the post-secular, which has its root in Kant, and then in John Rawls, the whole overlapping consensus. But with Fred Dallmayr, it is a different kind of genealogy. Of course, that also has a Kantian genealogy, but also his own life as a open practicing Christian. That is so significant. He was born in a city which was, I'm just remembering that city near Stuttgart in Germany, which was the place of the signing of the peace treaty. So therefore, he always carries that life of, a practitioner in a very open sense. And therefore, Fred Dallmayr's philosophical journey, we can relate to some of the philosophers like Paul Ricoeur, who also in his own way makes an interesting open communication between his own religious path, spiritual path, which does not compromise his critical philosophical path, a bit like Gyani Bhatimo and a bit like Derrida also, who is not, though he's not a practitioner, I do not know about the practice, spiritual practice of Derrida, but at least in his own journey, he's so open to Kabbalah tradition, to Jewish mystical traditions, so on and so forth. And Dallmayr also has taken part in a work like the Barkari movement in Maharashtra. We know every year there is a pilgrimage from one place to the Pandharpur. He has taken part, and therefore his post-secular genealogy is very much kind of a planetary life world in which we take part in varieties of spiritual and life alternative visions. And Gandhi and Sri Aurobindo also plays a very important role. And also contemporary thinkers like Ashish Nandi and Fred Dallmayr has written an essay on global development in which he discusses the work of Rajani Kochari and Ashish Nandi. And we can here remember Nandi's critique of the secular, and where he has an essay, a kind of a provocative essay called Towards an Anti-Secular Manifesto. Now, with Ashish Nandi, the critique of the secular is also accompanied by the critique of the state. I wanted to suggest, therefore, the whole post-secular vision and practice must also have certain kind of limits of the state, and therefore post-secular and the post-state in that sense. And therefore, and in Habermas to some extent, going beyond the state to some extent, one can look at public sphere or civil society. With Fred Dallmayr also, the kind of the critique of the state, again one can find its genealogy in Gandhi and Sri Aurobindo. Therefore, I want to submit that the whole invitation of the post-secular today must be broadened from the familiar discourses of Habermas. And we, of course, remember the very gentle dialogue between Habermas and Dallmayr on some of these issues, in which Habermas in Dallmayr submits that Habermasian critique is still too much posited in an argumentative mode, in a sense of argumentative competence, and it does not embody that much of listening. And therefore, one important path of the post-secular is the path of dialogue, dialogue among religions, dialogue between the secular and the religious, dialogue between science and religion. And therefore, Dallmayr's critique of positivism also is very important. And therefore, that critique of positivism and Dallmayr's own contributions to the whole multiverse of the post-positivist, to which, for example, a philosopher from India, Professor Dallmayr, deeply appreciates. Now, Dallmayr's critique is very important here. We have this multiple genealogy of the post-secular, and then come to the religion. Therefore, the religious, in terms of going beyond religious orthodoxy, but not being anti-religious, constitutes an important path of the post-secular. Here, therefore, from the Indic notion, the notion of the dharma or the dhamma, both the Buddhist tradition or the Indian tradition, with which Dallmayr also has. So from this is the notion of dharma. Dharma is to hold, dharayati iti dharma. One which holds, it is dharma. But this holding has two kinds. One is holding that which exists. For example, if we have a conventional so-called dharma discourse that women must be subordinated to men. Now, this is a kind of a status quo dharma, and that has been a kind of degradation of dharma. The sense that it is written in Bhagavad Gita, that udhare udharat manam. That means we hold ourselves, and we hold ourselves up. Wherever we are, we try to hold ourselves up. And that sense of evolution, it is not just linear progress, but a kind of a creative evolution that with temporary in physical and spiritual aspirations. If religion, as John was pointing to, now the power is very different, the political and the power. We can have a vision of the political, which is not enslaved to power play, but unfortunately the discourse of the religion in the Latin sense, as Derrida say, that when he hears the word religion, he hears the word power. And therefore, now dharma here, we can bring the notion of religion and the dharma in an open sense and have a dialogue between dharma and religion in this sense, the dialectic between power and the whole capacity and the aspiration to uphold. Therefore, upholding our world, and that upholding our world is also an act of purushartha. And we know the discourse of the purushartha in the Indic tradition, dharma, artha, kama, moksha. But dharma, artha, kama, moksha, as they are imprisoned in the contemporary discourse and practice, and we would have to bring all of them together, as Dayakrishnan argues. So this is that how we have to uphold our world, and both religion and spirituality, state, civil society, all of us today, in front of the climate collapse, for example, and therefore the post-secular today has to have dialogue with nature, and all of us together, we try to uphold our world so that we avoid ourselves from the apocalypse. We are able to live together meaningfully. The other component of my presentation here is regenerating our art, and therefore the post-secular today, because as it is coming from the secular, coming from a kind of isolation between the state and nature, for example. So how do we regenerate our art? And here Dallmayr's book, A Return to Nature, is very important. And I was nurturing a symposium on cross-fertilizing roots and routes, in which John also has taken part, Dallmayr had taken part, in which Dallmayr brings the notion of the earth and the world from Heidegger. So this component is regenerating our art. And then I bring the notion of Lokasangraha, that how against the so against the apocalypse, he talks about care. He refers to Lokasangraha, and he says that the whole idea of taking care of the world, that is an important concern with Hannah Arendt and Martin Heidegger. And that is also the concern of Lokasangraha, again, to uphold our world. And then this is a concern of also in China, Tianxia, all under heaven. So I bring this idea of Lokasangraha, which is not only the gathering of people, but gathering of soul. And that Loka means both space and time. And so these are some of the thoughts that I wanted to weave together to celebrate the deep journey of Fred Dallmayr, and how we can walk and meditate with Fred Dallmayr on the eve of his 93rd birthday, and come together and think together. As John says, thinking is a revolutionary act, and therefore let us and every revolution has a sense of romance in the sense that the romantic of envisioning something new, and in our own ways practicing it. Therefore, there is also a sense of the poetic in Fred, and that sense of the poetry of living, poetry of philosophy, a poetry, a kind of enthusiasm of a new mode of thinking, but and that a new mode of thinking is so gentle, because like the great thinkers of the world, for example, like Shankaracharya Now, he spends a lot of time in interpreting the great thinkers. He is not a system builder, and that kind of gentility of listening deeply to other people's thinking and only coming towards the end. And that one or two lines is like the apex of thinking. It is like the crown of a temple of thinking. So this is my, offering to our conversation, please. And now, since I joined late, Randhir, you can kindly moderate the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for articulating the very significant and deep idea of Professor Dallmayr, that is integral pluralism. And because of this concept, he challenged the very idea of international realism or religious right, like political Islam for that matter. And very Ashish Nandi's you just mentioned the word Ashish Nandi. Ashish Nandi is also very critical and creative thinker who really challenged the Weberian question of religion, and that is true particularly in Indian sense, and incorporating Habermas ideas really completes Dallmayr's vision and thinking. Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite the respected participant. If you have any question, please indicate me in the chat box. So I invite Gyan Gului, Professor Gyan Gului from Italy, to kindly make.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
thank
please.
you very much. I hope you can hear me. Well,
yes.
I thank you. It was wonderful, of course, and I would like to perhaps ask a question that is, while listening at the different very interesting contributions, I was remembered, but perhaps I can be mistaken, that there is an influence or at least an interest of Professor Dallmayr towards the theological thought of Paul Tillich. Because if I am not mistaken, if I correctly understood the contributions, there is in Dallmayr an attention to the criticism of some rather philosophical tradition, like that of Descartes, like that of subjectivism, or of the opposition between subject and object, substance and not substance, but subject and object, and subjectivism. And Dallmayr seems to criticize this idea, which is widely diffused in the tradition of the Western philosophy, to the advantage of an opposite view, which is a rather relational view of the subjects with each other. That is not an opposition of subject and objects, but a valorization of the category of relation. And in this sense, the theological thought of Paul Tillich has given in past century a kind of new source for some interpretation of theological Christianity. That is, the idea that God should not be seen and could not be seen into a perspective of absolute subject, God on the one side, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the universe, the world, and of course, we as subject. But Tillich has rather proposed a theology in which God is the source of being, God above God, God as a source of being, and not something which is the absolute subject contraposed to the creation and the creations. That is not a theological thought in which there is creator and creatures, and there is a line of separation between them. But God is himself the ground of being, which is common to, which opens to a relational view of between creator and creations. And I see that in some aspects of Dallmayr, there is an attempt, at least, to bring this theological thought of Paul Tillich into a philosophical perspective which opposes the traditional Descartian, but not only Descartian, opposition between subject and object. This is my interest, that is whether there is a theological fundament in the thought of Professor Dallmayr and the transposition of this theological thought into the philosophy, into a philosophical tradition which opposes the idea of the absolute subject. Thank you and congratulations for the brilliant expositions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gyanaguli. Now I would like to invite Minati Pradhan. And please, friend, if you have any question, let me indicate in the chat box.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are audible.
Good evening, everyone. I don't know, after listening to this mesmerizing presentation of all the learned person, I'm apprehensive about asking a basic question. So, actually, I mean, I would like to ask Professor Edwin. He was towards the end, he was talking about humanism and healing and salvation things. So that one point was there. How did Dallmayr prefer rationality over the static identity? If you would put little bit light on that, so I'll be enriched. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. So any other participant? Yes. Please, sir.
I would like.
Father,
Can I respond? Okay.
Sure.
Yes. And the questioner, I think I didn't see the name, but I just want to ask you basically. There has been in the philosophical movement always schools which come as thesis and antithesis. You know that. Okay, it has always been. That's how the progress of philosophy has been happening over centuries, and we know that. But today, looking at this movement of thesis and antithesis is not the vital element in Dallmayr's perspective. In fact, in talking aspects of salvaging or redemptive aspects, though he may sound highly theological, he's not against reason actually. Dallmayr's notion here is something like Heidegger's notion of openness to humanity. Dasein is openness to humanity. And that is why very often Dallmayr's approach should be like Heideggerian as letting be. When you say letting be, it may look very passive and it may look very, kind of segregated thing. No, letting be is actually a movement of care, a movement of care. And that is why the pure rationality is not in any way questioned. In fact, even in his dialogue with Habermas or Gadamer, Dallmayr has always been moving towards the element of going beyond the reason, but it is not in any way negating reason, in no way subjugating or subalienating reason. And that is why it's more enhancing, because the reflective element is more for care, for action, for the other. That is the motion that Dallmayr carries with him. Thank you. I hope I've just thrown some light.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
Ms. Randhir, can I
Yes.
just add one more thing, please?
Please, sir.
Yeah, I just want to bring here, as Professor John Clammer has beautifully summarized the way in which Dallmayr's philosophy and writings can be placed. One word that he used is the border crossings. And I want to reiterate that Dallmayr was always in taking elements to and fro. In fact, he was reading Bernard Waldenfeld's philosophy. That is very important element for border crossing. There was a kind of tension between French and Italian and those days and all. So border crossing is German, for example, East German, West German. It's very difficult. But Dallmayr brings in the notion, they're saying, no, border crossing is not going out, is going to and fro, to and fro. In fact, that is the notion of the real dialogue. And therefore, that one element is very important for Dallmayr. He is practiced in himself. That's why he was able to bring so many things and also infuse so many things. So that is one I think I wanted to reiterate. Secondly, Dallmayr's work is something which is, as we are talking about post-secular debate, he has moved to post-secular faith already. The post-secular faith. Now, that is a very beautiful aspect which Dallmayr has presented as post-secular faith is not a religion, a religious tradition with action, religious conviction with service. It is not in contestation, whether my religion or your religion, or the supremacy of your scripture or my scripture, but it is in religious traditions with care, with the service, with karma. That is a post-secular faith he has already moved into. And, that's a beautiful thing. Maybe I could share that. I have a soft copy with people. So that's a very beautiful thing, way in which it is worked out also. That is another very important element, contribution for our times now, post-secular faith. So in no way, as Dr. John Clammer said, religion will not die, okay? But the religious elements, religious intolerance will always be there, but it will bring out better aspect of religionness, okay, religiousness. So that's one. And lastly, there is a very interesting, poem from German writers, and which Heidegger quotes. And one word is called homecoming. Homecoming. Okay, very interesting. I just want to conclude with that. It is actually homecoming is always letting the other person in, and we are also able to go into them or go with them, and especially in terms of culture. And in German, the word is Heimkunft, which is a very important element for learning and relearning. Homecoming is such an important word for Heidegger that Dallmayr brings this in the notion of, for us, a very important element in politics. Homecoming, and important elements of politics. That is, you're able to bring in so much of variety in the world. It's because you're open to the homecoming. You're open to the things that are very important. We always go and come back and crisscross and all that. So this is another beautiful element, much more. And of course, as the others mentioned, this is one of the last books was on Return to Nature and Integral Pluralism, and that summarizes a lot of things. And in fact, in my research, I have quoted also the latest ones because it brings in fact, right now, latest one, Pope Francis writing about Fratello Tutti, it's about ecology, ecological concerns. Also the other one, Laudato Si, there is also friendship, fellowship and all that, connected with what Dallmayr is saying. Okay, we need to be integrally, importantly, consistent, not only with the other being, with all aspects of nature. So this is also another contribution, which is global, which is very much global, I would say. That's my thing. And I really thank Professor John Clammer for, for me also, you might look as if summarizing my own thesis, it looked like. She was so beautifully presented Dallmayr in perspectives. And I really want to thank for that. And also Professor Giri, he knows me well. We have met, we have worked together in several things. And Professor Giri has always been very supportive, very encouraging, very open person, actually. In fact, that is what exactly Dallmayr in concept of, that transformation. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Professor John Clammer, sir, your comment, last comment.
Okay, we've stirred up so many interesting things. Gianluigi's point is very interesting. And I haven't read Dallmayr's latest book. I will now go and look for it, the one on nature. But I think in earlier kind of theological discourse, this notion of God as a ground of being is very important, partly because I think it forms the basis for a kind of dialogue. My somewhere in my own library, there are shelves of books on comparative religion. And they're often the usual kind of stuff. This religion began here with this, and the doctrines are this, and these are the teachings, and we're supposed to get something an insight into the nature of that religion from that kind of approach. And I mean, up to a point, that again is okay, but I don't think it takes you very deeply. And worse still, it doesn't really promote dialogue. It doesn't promote the grounds on which people from very different spiritual traditions can in fact talk to each other. So I think on the one hand, this notion of God is the ground of being is extremely important, because I think it bypasses a lot of those kind of classical doctrinal disputes and that kind of thing. But the other thing is, I think it converges greatly with discussions about ecology. And a number of people have been saying, I think quite rightly now, that ecology provides one of the grounds of dialogue between religious traditions that didn't exist before. Again, we could argue about the doctrines and the usual stuff where we never really come to a kind of common ground. But ecology is a kind of ground on which we can all stand, and we can draw on our own individual spiritual traditions. But that doesn't, nevertheless, that gives us a way in which we can talk to each other, which transcends. Now, I don't know if Dallmayr had anything like that in mind when I haven't read the book, unfortunately, yet. But I think that would be an important thing to derive from our conversation today. And this now, the ground of being, this idea of homecoming in German is Heimat. The idea that going home is something which appears in all sorts of religious traditions. Now, oddly enough, I was quoting a friend a verse from Rumi, the poet. Let me see if I can find it here. In fact, in his own spiritual couplets, actually from a very different position, from a Sufi tradition, talks about exactly the same things. The idea that the in a sense the meaning of life is discovering that route home. And home will take you back actually to that depth of religious experience. This may be approached by different people in different ways because of the formal religious labels we attach to ourselves. But beyond that, there is a kind of ground of being which we all share because we're all human beings. We all occupy the same planet. So I think that's important. Those are all very important questions you've raised. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now it's time to say goodbye. So before goodbye, today I'm going to give a vote of thanks. So I am very thankful and grateful to all the distinguished speakers, Professor John Clammer, Professor Kumar Giri sir, Father Edwin, for giving such a very mesmerizing and excellent presentations. And I also thanks all the discussing and all the respected participants who raised very important questions, all the viewers listening. Thank you so much.
Thank you from all of us too.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.